There is a particular kind of silence that exists only in the spaces between a threat and its execution. Not the silence of an empty room. Not the silence after a door slams. This silence has weight. It has temperature. It settles against your skin like the breath of something enormous that hasn't decided yet whether it wants to devour you. ELENA VASQUEZ knew that silence. She had been sitting in it for 11 minutes. She knew because she'd watched every one of those minutes tick across the analog clock above her studio door, and the man responsible for it had not moved. He sat in the worn leather chair across from her drafting table, one ankle crossed over his knee, his dark suit untouched by the November rain that had soaked everyone else who'd walked through her door that day. His hands rested in his lap with a stillness that frightened her more than aggression would have. People who had nothing to prove did not fidget. People who had already won did not rush. NIKOLAI RENKO had already won something. She simply didn't know what. "You haven't started," he said. His voice was low, unhurried, the kind of voice that understood it would always be heard, so it never felt the need to raise itself. ELENA looked down at the blank sketchpad in her lap. Her charcoal pencil was in her hand. She hadn't made a single mark. "I'm observing," she said. The corner of his mouth moved. Not quite a smile. Something more dangerous than that. "So am I." She should have turned this commission down. She knew it the moment his assistant had called. A woman with a voice like expensive silk, who had explained, with the precision of someone reading from a contract, that Mr. Renko required a portrait. Not a photograph, a portrait, done by hand. By ELENA specifically. She should have said no. She had said yes. And now she sat 3 feet from the most dangerous man in the city, her charcoal poised over white paper, trying to remember that she was a professional, that she drew criminals every week for the department, that a face was just a face, lines and shadows and the architecture of bone beneath skin. But Nikolai Renko's face was not just a face. It was a sentence, written in a language she was only beginning to understand, and she had the terrible, bone-deep suspicion that by the time she finished translating it, there would be no going back. Chapter 1. The Commission. 3 days earlier, ELENA had been doing what she did every Tuesday afternoon, arguing with a coffee machine. The machine in the break room of the Whitmore building, a squat, smoke-stained tower in the middle of the Arts District, where she rented studio space on the 4th floor, had been waging a personal war against her for 2 years. Every other tenant got their coffee. ELENA got a cup of hot brown water with the consistency of regret. She was in the middle of threatening it with a very specific kind of violence when her phone rang. "ELENA VASQUEZ? Speaking. My name is Irina Sokolova. I'm calling on behalf of Nikolai Renko. He's interested in commissioning a portrait." ELENA put down her terrible coffee. "What kind of portrait?" "A formal one. He's seen your work at the Meridian Gallery, the series on the longshoremen. He was particularly moved by the way you captured emotion in stillness." His words. ELENA blinked. She hadn't expected that. Most of her clients were either the police department, who used her forensic artistry to build composites, or wealthy couples who wanted anniversary gifts. The occasional eccentric collector. Who exactly is Nikolai Renko? He's a businessman, with significant interests in the city's shipping and development sectors. ELENA had looked him up the moment she'd hung up the phone. Nikolai Renko, 34 years old, born in St. Petersburg, moved to the States at 19. Current CEO of Renko Holdings, which had its fingers in every legitimate pie in the city. Real estate, private security, maritime logistics. Net worth estimated somewhere between obscene and small country. Also, the last name Renko appeared in 16 Department of Justice reports, 4 Senate testimony transcripts, and 1 very thorough Interpol notice that had, notably, never resulted in charges. She had called her friend Detective Marcus Webb at 11 that night. "Renko," Marcus had said, and the single word carried a decade of investigative exhaustion. "ELENA, no. He wants a portrait. He wants something. It is never what he says it is. Marcus, he is not a man you do business with, unless you are prepared for the business to change you. Are you prepared for that? She had thought about it for the rest of the night, stared at the blank canvases stacked against her studio wall, thought about the gallery show she'd been trying to fund for 2 years. The commission fee Irina Sokolova had mentioned, a number that had made her sit down, would have covered 6 months of studio rent and the printing costs for the entire show. She had called back in the morning. I'll take the commission. He arrived on Thursday at 4 in the afternoon. Elena had set up her studio carefully, not for him, she told herself, but because she was a professional. The light was right, the chair was positioned, her materials were laid out with the precision of a surgeon's instruments. He walked in and looked at everything in the room before he looked at her. The way a person looks at a room they're considering buying. Then he looked at her. He was taller than she'd expected. The photographs online had not done justice to the particular quality of stillness he carried. That sense of contained power, of a body that moved only when it chose to, of eyes that registered everything without advertising the fact. He had dark hair, cut close at the sides, and a face that would have been beautiful if it had been willing to be. It wasn't. It was something better than beautiful. It was interesting. The kind of face that made you want to keep looking because you kept finding new things in it. Miss Vasquez. He extended his hand. She shook it. His grip was firm without being demonstrative. Mr. Renko, can I get you anything before we start? Water? Coffee? You have a photograph of me on your wall, he said. She turned. There, pinned among the reference images on her corkboard, newspaper clippings, architectural prints, anatomy sketches, was a small printout. Him, leaving a courthouse 2 years ago. She felt heat climb her neck. Research, she said evenly. Of course. He settled into the chair. I don't mind. I find it useful when people do their research. Does it change how you behave, knowing someone has looked into you? He considered this with what she was already coming to understand was his characteristic unhurriedness. No, he said finally. I am the same regardless of who is watching. The difference is only in whether people are surprised. She picked up her charcoal. Hold still, she said. I always do. She began to draw. The first marks were always the most important, not for the final image, but for what they told the artist about the subject. She could read them the way other people read text. The distance between features as a map of ancestry, the set of the jaw as a record of old tensions, the architecture around the eyes as the truest autobiography a person would ever write. Nikolai Renko's face told her things she wasn't sure she wanted to know. The jaw, disciplined, set but not cruel. This was not a man who raged, he was a man who decided. There was a difference, and it was written into the bone. The eyes, dark, wide-set, framed by the faint traces of something that might have been sleeplessness, or might have been the long-practiced habit of vigilance. They were not warm, but they were not cold either. They were attentive, acutely, uncomfortably attentive. He was watching her watch him. Most people look away, she said, without looking up from the paper. Most people are uncomfortable being seen, he replied. And you're not? I'm the most seen person in any room I enter. I made my peace with it a long time ago. A pause. The question is whether you're uncomfortable seeing me. She kept her hand steady. It's my job. That's not an answer. She looked up then, met those dark, attentive eyes. No, she said, I'm not uncomfortable. It was, she would later reflect, the first lie she told him. They worked for 2 hours. He sat with the patience of stone. She drew. Occasionally she asked him to turn slightly, to angle his chin, to look left. He complied without comment. At 6 o'clock she set down her charcoal. First session, she said. I'll need 3, maybe 4. He stood, looked at the sketch pad she was holding, the rough study, all planes and shadows, not yet a portrait, but clearly the architecture of one. Something crossed his face. She had a name for the expression in her taxonomy of human emotion, not of himself in the image. Something else. Something more interior. You're very good, he said. I know. Another not quite smile. He reached into his jacket and produced a card. Laid it on her drafting table. Same time Saturday? Saturday works. He moved to the door, hand on the frame. He paused, and she noticed he did this deliberately, that nothing he did was accidental. Miss Vasquez, the photograph on your corkboard. What about it? I'm not leaving the courthouse in that image. I'm entering it. She looked. He was right. When she looked back, he was gone. She stood alone in her studio, in the thin November light, holding her sketch pad, and felt the room recalibrate around the absence of him. As if his presence had shifted the air pressure, and now the atmosphere was finding its way back to normal. She looked at the sketch. Even unfinished, even rough, even barely more than a structural map, it was the most alive face she had ever drawn. Chapter 2. His Rules. He came back on Saturday, and the Saturday after that. By the third session, Elena had stopped pretending that this was a normal commission. Normal commissions did not send her flowers on Wednesday morning. Dark red roses, no card, no note, just the flowers sitting outside her studio door when she arrived. Normal commissions did not know that she preferred her coffee black, and appeared to have communicated this preference to the cafe downstairs, which began leaving a cup on the counter labeled Vasquez every morning without her ordering it. Normal commissions did not call her, not to reschedule, not to confirm, just to talk, at 9 in the evening when she was cleaning brushes and thinking about nothing in particular. "What do you see?" he asked one of those evenings, "when you draw a person who frightens you?" She paused, charcoal pencil in hand, still standing at the drafting table even though he wasn't there, because she'd been refining the portrait, and she thought better when she was on her feet. "Who says I'm frightened? Your lines are sharper when you're uncertain. You press harder. It's in the work." She looked at the portrait in front of her. He was right. The jaw was overworked. She'd gone over that line 4 times. "I see the truth," she said finally. "When I draw someone who frightens me, the fear strips away the flattery. I can't make them softer than they are. I can't be kind to the image, because the image doesn't need my kindness. Is that what you're doing with mine? Being unkind?" "I'm being accurate." A pause. Outside her window the city made its nighttime noises, distant traffic, a siren 2 blocks away, the low bass percussion of the bar on the corner. "I think," Nikolai said, "that you are the only person who has been accurate about me in a very long time." She didn't know what to do with that. She set down the pencil. "Why do you want a portrait?" she asked. "You could have any photographer. You could have had a commission done by any of a dozen artists with bigger reputations than mine." "I didn't want any of them." "Why not?" A longer pause. The silence between them had changed over the past 2 weeks. Early on it had been watchful, his silence assessing, hers defensive. Now it felt different. More like the silence between 2 people who have reached the part of a conversation where words require more precision. "I saw your work in that gallery," he said. "The Longshoreman series. There was one piece, the older man, looking out at the water. Do you remember it?" "Dmitri," she said. "He'd worked the docks for 40 years. What I saw in that drawing was not a man. It was an accumulation. Everything that had happened to him, everything he had carried, every choice he had made, it was all there in the way you drew the set of his shoulders, the way you drew the lines around his eyes. A breath. I have never in my life had someone see me that way. I wanted to know if you could." She sat down. Her hands, she noticed, were not entirely steady. "And," she asked, "I'll tell you when you're finished." The 4th session was a Saturday afternoon. January had settled over the city with a particular kind of gray permanence that made the light in her studio flat and honest. She'd been working on the eyes for an hour, the aspect of any portrait she always left last, because the eyes were where everything either succeeded or failed. He was watching her work. She could feel it, the same way she could feel weather changing. A shift in atmospheric pressure, a charge in the air. "Tell me something true," he said. She didn't look up. "About what?" "About yourself. Something you wouldn't tell someone you just met." "You're not someone I just met." "No, I'm not." She added a shadow beneath the left eye. Softened it immediately. Too much. "I'm afraid of what I'm capable of when I want something badly enough," she said. Quiet. "What do you want?" he asked. His voice was different, lower, less composed. She looked up. He was leaning forward slightly, barely, just a degree, and for the first time since she'd met him, he looked like a man who was not entirely in possession of himself. "Right now?" she asked. "Yes, to finish the portrait." He sat back, but the something in his eyes didn't recede. "Liar," he said softly. She returned to the drawing. "Your rules are interesting," she said after a moment. "You call when you feel like it. You send flowers without signatures. You've somehow arranged for me to receive free coffee every morning without asking if I wanted it. You rearrange the world to suit yourself, and then you wait to see how long it takes people to notice." "And how long did it take you?" 4 days. The coffee was the tell. I never mentioned I take it black." "I noticed. You had someone notice for you. The outcome is the same." "The process matters," she said firmly. Another pause. She could feel him thinking, a quality of silence that was different from the others, more active. "You're right," he said. She had not expected him to concede anything. He was looking directly at her with an expression she couldn't fully classify. It contained acknowledgement, and beneath it something that was almost wonder, which didn't belong on the face of a man like him and yet was unmistakably there. "I'll ask next time," he said. "There's going to be a next time?" "Yes." She held his gaze for 3 full seconds before she returned to the portrait. "Then ask," she said. "Don't arrange." "I'll practice," he said, and the dry thread of humor in his voice made her press her lips together to keep from smiling. She didn't entirely succeed. The portrait was nearly finished when she realized she had a problem. The face on the paper was not the face of a man she was afraid of. It was the face of a man she was learning, a man whose silences she had begun to translate, a man whose attention, which had felt like a searchlight in the beginning, had begun to feel like something more bilateral than that. Not just him watching her, but both of them watching each other. 2 people engaged in the specific and irreversible act of being seen. She should have been afraid of that. She wasn't. And that, she was beginning to understand, was far more dangerous. Chapter 3, Under the Skin. The phone call came on a Thursday morning, when she was mixing gesso and thinking about angles of light. "Not Nikolai. Marcus. You need to come to the precinct." His voice told her it wasn't a casual request. Elena set down the gesso, wiped her hands. What happened? Not on the phone. She drove to the precinct with the radio off and both hands on the wheel. Marcus met her in the 3rd-floor corridor, outside the Violent Crimes Unit, and ushered her into a conference room with the practiced efficiency of a man who spent his life moving people through difficult spaces. On the table were photographs. She recognized the man in them from the news, Gregor Solnik, a mid-level logistics executive who had been, if the papers were to be believed, a linchpin in a trafficking operation that had been dismantled 18 months ago. He had been cooperating with federal prosecutors. Had been, past tense, because he was dead. "He was found 2 days ago," Marcus said. "We have a witness. The witness says the last person to visit Solnik's apartment, 2 hours before time of death, was a man in a dark suit, medium build, dark hair, very still. The room temperature seemed to drop." "Marcus," she said carefully. "I'm not accusing him," Marcus said. He looked exhausted. "I'm telling you what the witness said. I'm also telling you that 3 people in my chain of command know you've been doing a commission for Renko, and I need to know. Elena, I need to know whether he has ever said anything to you, given you anything, asked you for anything unusual." "He asked me to draw his face. And that's all." "That is all." Marcus looked at the table. He was quiet for a long time. "He's dangerous, Elena. Not in the way the papers write about. The papers make him sound like a colorful character. He is not colorful. He is systematic and patient, and completely without sentiment when it comes to things that obstruct him. You understand?" "I understand." "Then stop the commission." She drove back to the studio, sat at the drafting table, looked at the portrait. The face on the paper looked back at her with those dark, attentive eyes. She had gotten the eyes right. It had taken 4 attempts over 3 sessions, but she had gotten them. The quality of contained vigilance, the intelligence beneath the stillness, and harder to name, easier to feel, the thing underneath both of those things, which was a kind of profound and practiced solitude. She had drawn lonely men before. She had drawn men who wore their loneliness like a wound, who couldn't sit in a room without it showing in the curl of their posture. Nikolai wore his differently. He wore it like armor, like something that had stopped being painful so long ago it had become structural. She was still sitting there at 6 o'clock when the door of the studio opened. She hadn't buzzed anyone in. She thought, briefly, about the security panel by the door, the one she'd never once used in 4 years. And then she looked up, and he was there. Dark suit, same quality of stillness, but something was different about him tonight. A tension in the set of his shoulders that hadn't been there before. A controlled velocity. "How did you get in?" she asked. "The building manager." "I didn't give anyone permission. I didn't ask for your permission." He closed the door behind him. "I needed to speak with you, and I didn't want to do it by phone." She stood up slowly. "You need to leave. Elena, I spoke with Detective Webb today. I know about Gregor Solnik." Something passed through his face, swift, controlled, but not absent. She caught it. She caught everything now, after weeks of studying him, the way she caught light changes in a room she'd spent time in. "What do you know about Gregor Solnik?" he asked. "That he's dead, that a witness places a man matching your description near his apartment 2 hours before he was found. And that Detective Webb has asked me to stop this commission." He was very still. "Are you going to?" he asked. "I don't know yet." "That's honest." "I'm generally honest." "I know." He moved then, not toward her, but to the side, toward the window, and she tracked him the way she always tracked him, with that heightened awareness that had become a habit. "I did not kill Gregor Solnik. I want you to know that." "Why should that matter to me?" He turned from the window. "Because I think it does matter to you, and I find I am unwilling to have you believe something about me that isn't true." "It isn't the only thing that matters," she said. Her voice came out steadier than she felt. "Whether you personally did it is one question. Whether you ordered it is another question entirely," he agreed. He met her eyes. "One I will not answer. Not because I'm trying to deceive you, because there are some questions that are better left between us unanswered." "That's not reassuring." "I know. I'm not offering you reassurance. I'm offering you the truth of what I can say, which is that I did not kill him, and that the situation is more complicated than Detective Webb's version of events allows for." She crossed her arms. The studio felt very small suddenly, not claustrophobic, but concentrated, the way a room concentrates before a storm. "Why does it matter to you?" she asked. "What I think? You've made it clear you don't justify yourself to people." He was quiet for a long moment. "I haven't cared what anyone thought of me in a very long time," he said. "It's a luxury I stopped being able to afford when I was young, and then it became habit." He paused. "Something about you disrupts that habit. I find that I want you to see me." "Why?" He crossed the room. She held her ground. She always held her ground. It was a point of pride. But her pulse was doing something unreasonable as he stopped in front of her, close enough that she could see the exact quality of the control he was exercising. "Because," he said, with a quiet precision that made each word land like it had been placed, "I had spent my entire adult life being an object to people, an asset, a threat, a means to an end. I have not, in a very long time, been a person." His eyes moved over her face, not invasively, but with the particular attentiveness she'd been on the receiving end of for weeks. "When you draw me, I am a person. I can see it in the work. That is not something I take lightly." The silence that followed was different from all the ones before it. It had a different texture. It was charged and warm, and it asked her something without using words. She looked at the portrait on the drafting table behind her, at the face she had spent 4 sessions and dozens of hours learning. I'm going to finish the portrait, she said. Elena, I'm going to finish it, not because you've convinced me of anything, because it isn't done, and I don't leave things unfinished. She looked back at him. But you are never to enter my studio again without my explicit permission. If I give you a key, you use it. If I don't give you a key, you knock. Those are my rules. He looked at her for a long moment, with that expression she'd first catalogued as recognition, and had since been forced to revise to something closer to hunger. The careful, restrained hunger of a person who has wanted something for a long time, and is only now allowing themselves to acknowledge it. Understood, he said. Good. Elena. What? Thank you. She had not expected that either. After he left, she stood alone in the studio for a long time. The November dark pressed against the windows. The city made its sounds. She picked up her charcoal and went back to work. She had the eyes almost exactly right. She had one more session to make them perfect. She was going to need it. Chapter 4. The Deal. The fifth session was not a session at all. She had texted him the day before, the first time she had initiated contact, a fact she was aware of with the clarity of a person who has been carefully tracking such things. She told him the portrait was finished, that he could come collect it at 2 on Saturday. He texted back a single word. Good. She had no idea what it signified, coming from him, whether it was satisfaction or something else, and the not knowing bothered her in a way she didn't want to examine. Saturday arrived with pale winter sunlight that came in at exactly the right angle for the portrait, which she had framed herself in a clean dark frame that was either exactly right or presumptuous. She couldn't decide which. He arrived at 2 precisely. She let him in and stood to the side as he approached the portrait, which she'd set on the easel at the center of the room. He stopped in front of it. She watched him look at himself. She had drawn a great many portraits in her life, and the moment of first contact between subject and finished work was one she had learned to read as carefully as the work itself. Some people recoiled. They hadn't expected to see what the artist had seen. Some people wept. Some people laughed, nervously, defending themselves against the exposure. Some people reached out and touched the glass. Nikolai was still. He looked at the portrait for a very long time. You didn't flatter it, he said eventually. I told you I wouldn't. You were more than accurate. What do you mean? He looked back at the portrait. You drew what I feel like from the inside, which is not something I expected anyone to be capable of. She had worked hard on that, on capturing the interior life of his face, the things he kept so controlled on the surface, that she'd had to extrapolate them from small moments. The fractional shift of his expression when she'd said something that surprised him. The way he breathed differently in the moments before he decided to tell her something true. Does it bother you? She asked. He considered. No, it's a relief, actually. To be seen by someone who isn't going to use it against me. She crossed to the window. The city was doing its weekend afternoon thing below. Sparse traffic, a few people with dogs, a delivery bike weaving between parked cars. Can I ask you something? She said. Yes. If you had grown up differently, if you'd been born somewhere else, to someone else, what do you think you would have done with yourself? A genuine pause. Not the calculating pauses she'd learned to distinguish from his authentic ones. This was authentic. Architecture, he said. She turned. Buildings, he said, with something careful in his voice, as if he was placing a fragile thing in unfamiliar hands. I was interested in how things were constructed, how they held together, how a structure could look completely different from the inside than from the outside. He paused. I went to school for 2 years before I had to leave. Had to leave. My father died. There were obligations. She nodded slowly. The inheritance of violence was a story she'd encountered in the forensic work. The way a particular kind of life passed from one generation to the next, not through choice, but through the accumulated weight of structure and expectation. She didn't say this. What about you? He asked. What about me? What else? Nothing else. She said it without hesitation. I couldn't not draw. It started when I was 4, apparently. My mother says I drew on everything. Windows, walls, my own hands. She used to say I was trying to prove something existed by capturing its outline. And are you? She looked at the portrait. I think, she said slowly, I draw because things frighten me less when I understand their structure, when I've mapped their lines. She paused. People especially. He crossed the room. She heard him moving behind her, not threatening, not crowding, just present. And then he was beside her, looking at the portrait from the same angle she was. Have I frightened you less? He asked, quietly. She thought of Marcus's voice on the phone. She thought of the photograph on the corkboard, entering, not leaving. She thought of the flowers without cards, and the coffee without her asking, and the way he'd walked into her studio without permission, not to threaten her, but because he hadn't wanted to wait. Yes and no, she said. Which part's yes? You as a person, she glanced at him, you don't frighten me the way you did. And the no? She was quiet for a moment. What I feel when you're in the room, she said. That frightens me considerably. The temperature in the studio changed. He turned toward her. She turned toward him. They were very close, had been close before, during sessions, but this was different, because neither of them was pretending it was professional anymore. Elena, he said. His voice was lower than usual. That controlled velocity she'd felt in him the night he'd let himself in. It was present again, but no longer quite as controlled. Don't, she said. He stopped immediately. Don't, she said again, softer. Not because the portrait is done and you've decided now is the moment. I didn't decide that. Then what? I've been trying to decide since the first session, he said. Whether to allow this. Whether to... He stopped, ran a hand across his jaw, a gesture she'd never seen from him before. The most unguarded thing she'd witnessed. You asked about rules. You're right that I arrange things. I've been trying very hard not to arrange this. Because I think you would leave if you felt managed, and I don't want you to leave. She absorbed that. That's the most honest thing you said to me, she said. I know. Can I be equally honest? Please. I'm not afraid of you, she said, but I am afraid of what you represent, what your world is, what happens to the people who get close to you. She met his eyes. I've read the reports, Nikolai. Not the news reports, the actual DOJ files. I have a friend who owed me a favor. He didn't look away. And, he said, and I'm still here, which tells you something about the state I'm in. The moment stretched. He reached up, slowly, deliberately, giving her every opportunity to step back, and tucked a strand of hair behind her ear. His fingertips barely grazed her jaw. It was the smallest possible touch. It felt like a detonation. I would not let anything happen to you, he said. You can't promise that. No, but I can tell you that I would burn considerable things to the ground before I permitted it. She looked at him for a long moment. That's terrifying, she said. I know. It should make me want to leave. Yes, it doesn't, she said. She didn't move. His mouth met hers, carefully at first, with a restraint that she understood came not from indifference, but from the opposite of it. From a desire so deliberate it required discipline. She felt herself go still, in the way she went still when something was exactly right, the way her hand went still over a drawing, when the line was finally true. Then his hand came up to her face, and the careful restraint dissolved into something else entirely, something honest and urgent and months in the making, and she kissed him back with the recklessness of someone who has spent too long being afraid of exactly this. When they separated, they were both breathing differently. He rested his forehead against hers. I want to make a deal with you, he said. What kind of deal? You keep drawing. I keep learning to ask instead of arrange. A pause. We see what this becomes. That's not much of a deal. It's a start. She pulled back enough to look at him. His face, 6 inches from hers, was the face from the portrait, but animated now, open in a way the portrait couldn't have captured, because she hadn't seen it until this moment. You said something to me in the first session, she said, that most people are uncomfortable being seen, that you'd made peace with it. Yes, I think you lied. I think you made peace with being seen from a distance, by the public, by the press. She looked at him carefully. Being seen up close is different. You're still getting used to it. He was quiet for a moment. You see too much, he said. That's my job. It is also, he said with a directness that landed without warning, the thing about you that I am most thoroughly undone by. She felt that, in her chest, clean and sharp, the way a true line felt. Deal, she said. Chapter 5, Fracture Lines. January gave way to February, and February gave way to something that didn't have a name yet. It was the space between what they were and what they were becoming. A territory without maps, populated entirely by a man who had never navigated anything without knowing the outcome in advance, and a woman who had spent her career learning to trace lines that were already there, not ones still being drawn. They existed in each other's spaces carefully at first. He came to the studio. She went, twice, 3 times, to his apartment, which occupied the top floor of a building he owned in the financial district, and which should have been intimidatingly perfect, and somehow wasn't, because there were books everywhere, architectural drawings pinned to walls, and a kitchen that showed signs of actual use. "You cook," she said, the first time she found him there. "I find it useful. It requires precision." He was making something with fennel and lemon that smelled extraordinary. "Also, I find most restaurant food unsatisfying, because you can't control the variables." He looked at her over his shoulder. "You're doing that thing." "What thing?" "Reading me and then saying the reading out loud." "It's only rude if I'm wrong." "You're not wrong." She moved through the kitchen, trailing her fingers along the marble counter. On the wall above the dining table was the portrait. He'd hung it there, without ceremony. She discovered it the first time she came to the apartment, and said nothing, which seemed to be what he needed from her. They ate at the table below it. She kept finding her eyes, going up to the portrait, and then back to the man across from her. The gap between them, the face she'd drawn, and the face that was here, alive and talking and occasionally wry, was narrowing. Not because the portrait was wrong, but because she was adding information to it every day. "Tell me something," he said, over wine. "Your turn," she said. "You tell me something." "I don't sleep well," he said, without preamble. She looked up. "Haven't since I was 17, 4, maybe 5 hours a night." He turned the glass in his hands. "I've learned to use the extra hours. Most of what I've built was built between 2 and 5 in the morning." "What do you think about?" "Numbers, structural problems, things that need to be fixed." He paused. "Lately, other things." She didn't ask what. She knew. She reached across the table and took his hand. He looked at her hand over his, with an expression she'd never seen on a grown man before, startled, as if he'd forgotten that people did this, just reached out and touched each other without reason or strategy or negotiation. She thought of Dmitri the longshoreman, 40 years on the dock, looking out at the water, the kind of accumulation that shows in shoulders and eyes. She tightened her hand over his. He turned his palm up and held hers. The crisis, when it came, arrived without announcement. It was a Tuesday, 3 weeks into February. She was at the precinct doing a composite sketch, a witness to an armed robbery, a case unrelated to anything involving Nikolai, just her regular work, when Marcus appeared in the doorway. She read his face immediately. Something was wrong in the way that had a specific shape. Not an emergency, but an inevitability. "When you're done," he said. She finished the composite, sent the witness home, went to Marcus's office, and closed the door. "The Solnik investigation," he said. "Federal level now. They've been looking at the entire network. They've been looking at Renko for a long time. I know. They're going to move on him." She was quiet. "They don't have enough for the big charges," Marcus said. "Not yet. But they have enough to bring him in. Enough to make it very public. Enough to—" He stopped, started again. "Elena, whatever is happening between you and him, you need to understand what that means." "What does it mean?" "It means that when this becomes public, you become part of the story. Not necessarily the legal story, but the public story. The press will look at you. His people will look at you. The federal task force will want to talk to you." He looked at her steadily. "Is he worth that?" She thought about the portrait, about his hands, Those precise, careful hands turned palm up over hers. About the 4 a.m. text she'd started getting. Just small things. The view from his window at that hour. An architectural detail he'd noticed walking to a meeting. Once a question about a painter she'd mentioned in passing, 3 weeks earlier, that he'd clearly been thinking about since then. About the way he said her name. Like it was a word with weight. "I don't know yet," she said, which was honest. She told him that night. He came to the studio at 8, and she told him all of it. Marcus's information, the federal investigation, the task force. She watched his face as she spoke. She had learned his face very well by now. He did not react with surprise. He reacted with the particular contained quality of a man who has been waiting for a specific weather event and is watching it arrive from a window he has prepared for. "You knew this was coming," she said. "I've been expecting a federal move for 8 months. I'm more surprised it took this long." "Then you know what it means." "For me?" "Yes. For us." He stood very still. The space between them felt enormous and specific, like a gap that had been measured. "What does it mean to you?" he asked. Not with genuine inquiry, the same way he approached everything that mattered to him, she'd found. "It means I need to decide something," she said. "I need to decide whether I am a person who—" She stopped. Started again. "I have a career built on working with law enforcement. I have a reputation built on integrity. And I am," she looked at him, "I am whatever this is with you. I am this, and I don't know how those two things coexist." He came toward her. She held her ground. "Tell me what you need," he said. "I need the truth. Not what you can't tell me. I accept that there are things you can't tell me. I need to know that what you've given me has been true. Every word." The Solnik situation. "I did not kill him." His voice was level and absolute. "I will not tell you everything around that situation, but that specific fact. I did not kill him. I did not order it, and I am not sorry he's dead, because he was not a good man. That is the truth." She looked at him for a long time. "I believe you," she said. "Elena, I believe you," she repeated. "And I need you to understand that believing you and being at peace with everything around you are two different things. I'm working on the second one." He stopped in front of her. That contained velocity was there, more tightly wound than she'd ever felt it. There was something almost desperate in the quality of his stillness, the way an architectural structure can be perfectly composed and also bearing enormous load. "I know what I am," he said. "I have never pretended to you to be otherwise. I know. I have also never—" He stopped. Something crossed his face that she couldn't name. Some fracture in the composed surface. "I have never in my life wanted to be different for someone. I find myself now wanting to be different for you. I don't know what to do with that." She reached up and took his face in her hands. He went absolutely still beneath her palms. She felt his jaw, the structure she'd drawn so many times, the architecture she knew intimately from charcoal and hours of study. She felt him under her hands as a real thing, a live thing, a person. "You don't have to be different," she said. "I'm not asking for that. I'm asking for honesty. I'm asking to be seen and to see you." She looked at him. "That's all I've ever wanted from anyone." He closed his eyes. When he opened them, something in them had shifted. Something had been allowed forward that was usually kept behind several layers of control. "I am going to handle the federal situation," he said. "I have lawyers, and I have leverage, and I have been preparing for this for months. It will not destroy me, but it will be," he paused, loud, for a while. "I know. I need to know that you'll be safe while it's loud. That means I'm going to have to—" He stopped. She could see him physically restraining the impulse to arrange things. "Ask," she said. "What?" "Whatever you were about to arrange. Ask instead." "Then, can I have someone watch your building, just while this is happening? Not intrusively. Just a car outside?" "Yes. Yes," she said, "you can." He kissed her then, not the careful first kiss, not the restrained opening of a door. This was different. This was his hands in her hair, and her hands on his chest, and both of them fully present in the fracture line, in the uncertain space, neither of them pretending they were anywhere else or anyone other than who they were. When he pulled back, his forehead was against hers. "I practice on you," he said against her hair. "Practice what?" "Being a person. Asking instead of arranging. Saying the thing instead of managing the situation." A pause, and she felt, rather than heard the next part. "You are the only person I have ever practiced on. This is my hobby now, this specific, terrifying practice, and I have no intention of giving it up." She laughed against his shoulder. She hadn't expected to laugh, and it surprised them both. "That," she said, "might be the most romantic thing you said to me." "It's also entirely accurate," he said, which made her laugh again. Outside the studio windows, the city was doing what it always did, moving at its own indifferent speed. But in here, in this room with the portrait on the wall, and the charcoal dust on the drafting table, and his arms around her, something had settled. Not safely, not permanently. She was too honest with herself to claim that, but truly. And for now, that was sufficient. Chapter 6. Carved in Crimson. The federal move happened on a Thursday. Elena heard about it the way most of the city heard about it. On the morning news with her coffee, in the 5 minutes before she was supposed to leave for the studio. Renko Holdings executives brought in for questioning. Offices briefly closed. Photographs of men in suits emerging from glass buildings into clusters of press and cameras. No Nikolai in any of the photographs. She texted him, "Are you okay?" No response for 4 hours. She worked, she drew. She fielded 3 calls from Marcus, which she let go to voicemail, and one from an unknown number that she answered and turned out to be a journalist, which she ended immediately. At noon, the text came back. "Yes, working. Tonight, if that's okay." She texted, "Yes." He came at 8. She buzzed him in. He arrived at her door looking like himself, suit, composure, the quality of a contained man, but with something worn into the surface. Not defeat, something more like the aftermath of a sustained effort. The specific exhaustion of someone who has been managing a crisis for 10 straight hours and has finally allowed themselves to stop. "Eat something," she said, because it was the right thing, and because she had, without examining the decision, already made pasta. He sat at her kitchen table and ate pasta and told her things. Not everything, she didn't expect everything, but things. The shape of the federal case, the charges they were pursuing, the names of the lawyers involved, the reasons he was confident and the reasons he was concerned. He told her these things the way he'd been learning to tell her things. Directly, without arrangement, without managing how she'd receive the information. She listened. She asked questions when she had them. She didn't flinch. "You're not frightened," he observed. "I'm very frightened," she said. "I'm just not running." He looked at her across the kitchen table with that specific expression, recognition and hunger and something newer, something she'd been watching develop over the past weeks, something that didn't have a clean name, but resided in the category of devotion. "Tell me why," he said. "Because I know the difference between a man who is dangerous and a man who is simply someone the law can't categorize neatly." "Because," she stopped, looked at her pasta, looked back up. "Because when I told you to knock instead of letting yourself in, you did. That matters more than it sounds." "An absurdly low bar," he said. "For most people, yes. For someone who's spent his entire life being able to open any door he chooses, no." He was quiet. "I want to tell you something," he said. "Tell me. I have never in my adult life allowed anyone into the parts of my life you've seen. The apartment, the insomnia, the thing about architecture." He looked at the table. "The thing about my father." He looked up. "I didn't intend this. I came to your studio to have my portrait done. I had no plan beyond that." "I know. And now I am." Something passed over his face, that rare fracture in the composed surface. "I am entirely without the usual maps. I don't know the terrain here. That is, if you want to know, the only thing that actually frightens me. And I've been threatened with considerably more frightening things than federal investigators." She stood up, walked around the table. He watched her come, stayed still, stayed present, didn't manage or arrange or prepare. She sat on the edge of the table beside him. "The thing about being lost," she said, "is that it's only a problem if you need to be somewhere else. You don't need to be anywhere else right now." He reached up and took her hand. "Elena." "Yes? I need to say something, and I need to say it without managing how it lands. So I'm going to say it, and then it's in the room, and whatever happens next, that's where we are." She waited. "I am in love with you," he said, quiet, with the same precision he applied to everything that mattered to him, and none of the usual management. "I understand if that is complicated by everything else I've told you tonight. I understand if it requires time, or distance, or recalibration. I am simply unable to be in this room with you and not have that said." The kitchen was very quiet. She looked at this man, this controlled, complicated, careful man, who had walked into her studio to have his face drawn, and had somehow, over 2 months of sessions and late-night phone calls, and shared meals and small deliberate acts of honesty, become the most known face she'd ever drawn, and she felt the thing that true lines felt like: certain, arrived at, real. "I know," she said. "You know?" "I know because it's in the portrait. It happened somewhere around the 3rd session, and I didn't know what to do about it, and I pretended I didn't see it for 3 more weeks. She looked at him. "I've been doing the same thing you've been doing, trying to decide whether to allow it." "And have you decided?" She leaned forward and kissed him. Not carefully, not tentatively, not with the restraint of a beginning, with the full weight of everything she'd learned. His face, his silences, his particular way of carrying the past, the way he said her name, the way he pressed his palm flat against her door jamb when he was thinking, the way he turned his palm up when she touched his hand. He kissed her back with everything he had. His hands were in her hair, and hers were at his collar, and the kitchen was warm, and the city was outside, and none of the problems had gone away. The federal investigation was still happening. The world was still the world. His name was still carved into the kind of history that didn't erase, and none of that had changed. But she had decided. When they separated, he stayed close, his hands on her face. "I should tell you something," he said against her temple. "Tell me." "I intend to be extremely difficult to get rid of." She pulled back to look at him. "Is that a warning?" "It's information, in the spirit of asking instead of arranging. And if I wanted to get rid of you, then I would respect that, with very great difficulty." He looked at her, honest, unhurried. "But I would hope, before that happened, that I had been given sufficient opportunity to be worth keeping." She looked at his face. The face she knew better than any face she'd ever drawn. The face she was still learning, would probably keep learning, for a long time. "You've already been worth keeping for a while," she said. "You're very slow to notice." Something in his face, subtle, interior, genuine, relaxed. It was the expression she'd been looking for since the first session. The face beneath the face. The man inside the composed exterior. The one she'd been excavating layer by layer. The one who was here now, in her kitchen, with his defenses down and his hands warm against her cheeks. She thought, "I could draw that. I'm going to draw that." "What are you thinking?" he asked. "That I need to draw you again," she said. He laughed. She hadn't heard him laugh before. Really laugh, not the wry sounds he made. And it was a revelation. Made him 20 years younger, and also, impossibly, more himself. "Of course," he said. "I'm your hobby. You're definitely my hobby. I'll make a terrible subject. I'll be completely insufferable." "You're already completely insufferable. It makes for compelling work." He drew her close again, and she went. And they sat in the warm kitchen, with the pasta cooling on the table, and the city going about its business outside, and the federal investigation somewhere in the middle distance. And Elena thought about the particular quality of silence she'd noticed the first day, the one that had weight and temperature, and asked something without using words. This silence was different. This silence was answered. Later, much later, after they'd moved from the kitchen to the couch and talked until 2 in the morning about things that mattered and things that didn't, he said, I want to take you somewhere, when this is settled, somewhere I've never taken anyone. Where? St. Petersburg, in summer. He was looking at the ceiling. She was beside him, her head on his shoulder, and she felt him breathe as he spoke. I haven't been back in 15 years. There are buildings there I want to show you, and I want to see what you see when you look at them. She was quiet for a moment. That's very specific, she said. I'm a specific person. Yes, she said, you are. She tilted her head up to look at him. He looked down at her. The apartment was quiet, except for the low ambient sound of the city, and the lamp by the window threw the room in warm gold. And she thought, this is what it looks like, this specific thing. This is what it looks like when two people stop managing themselves at each other and just arrive. Okay, she said. Okay? Show me the buildings. Something in his face, in those dark attentive eyes she'd drawn 6 times now and would draw again, went very still and very warm simultaneously. Okay, he said. Outside, the February city was cold and indifferent and entirely itself. Inside the warm apartment, under the portrait of a man she'd spent months learning to see, ELENA VASQUEZ made a decision. Not a safe one, not an uncomplicated one. A true one. The full one, the one she'd first seen on that February night in her kitchen. The one that changed his face, that she'd drawn 4 times now in a new series that had nothing to do with forensics, and everything to do with the specific project of learning someone. The show was scheduled for April. Not the gallery she'd originally been saving for, a bigger one, with better light, in the kind of building that made her think he'd had something to do with securing it. Except that she'd asked, and he'd held his hands up, and said, not this time, which she'd chosen to believe. The centerpiece was the original portrait. Around it, the subsequent drawings, the study of his hands, the sketch of him sleeping. She'd done it once without his knowledge, and he'd found it and gone very quiet, and then said, keep it, which she'd understood as the kind of permission that took considerable excavation to arrive at. The series was called Accumulated, after Dmitri, after the longshoreman and his 40 years, and his shoulders in the water, after the idea that a person is everything they've carried, visible in the way they hold themselves, readable to anyone willing to look long enough and honestly enough. She had looked long enough. She had looked honestly enough. She had found in the architecture of a face she'd been hired to document and had ended up living inside, something she hadn't expected to find. A person who had been waiting to be found. They flew to St. Petersburg in June, when the city stayed light until midnight, and the canals caught the low sun and held it. He walked her through streets he remembered from his childhood, quieter now, more interior, and showed her buildings with the focused attention of a man who had been denied this particular pleasure for 15 years. She drew constantly, in the margins of menus, on hotel stationery, on the backs of maps. She drew the buildings, the waterways, the light on water, at 10 p.m. She drew him, looking up at a facade, standing at a canal railing, sitting across a small table in a cafe too cramped and perfect for its own good. One afternoon, standing in front of a building he'd told her about, an administrative structure from the 1820s with a proportional logic that he explained to her for 20 minutes, with the intensity of a man who had been saving the explanation for a long time. She drew without looking at the paper. She drew him explaining. When she showed him later, he was quiet for a long time. I look like I'm somewhere else, he said. You're in 1823, she said. You're imagining the construction. I can always tell. He looked at the drawing for a long moment, then at her. I don't have words for this, he said. You don't need words for it. Elena? Yes? I would like to arrange something. She raised her eyebrows. Oh? I would like to arrange, with your explicit permission and active desire, for you to always be the person who sees me this way. He held the drawing, for the rest of the available time, which I intend to be considerable. She looked at him in the St. Petersburg afternoon, this man she'd drawn 100 times and still wasn't finished learning, this man who had walked into her studio with a face that asked to be understood, and had stayed to do the same for her. That, she said, is actually asking instead of arranging. I've been practicing. I know. I've been keeping score. And full marks, she said, across the board. The evening was long and gold and unhurried. He kissed her in the Russian summer light, outside a 200-year-old building, in a city that had shaped him before she'd ever known he existed. And she kissed him back with the full weight of everything she'd learned, which was considerable, and the full anticipation of everything she hadn't learned yet, which was more, which was the point. Two people, the specific project of being known, the particular courage of being seen. No maps, no guarantees, the only things worth any of it.